Hello everybody and welcome again to Black Cat Theology. I'm Dr. Peter Dillard and this is our ongoing discussion of possible connections between the later philosophy of Martin Heidegger and contemporary non-metaphysical theology. Today is D-Day, in that we're going to make a decision that will determine the course we pursue in the remaining lectures in this series. Remember that last time we began to construct a ledger in which we were comparing respective strengths and weaknesses of each theological option that I extracted from Heidegger's later writings. The point of this comparison is that by listing these respective strengths and weaknesses, at the end of the day, we might see that one option is clearly preferable to the other because it has more strengths and fewer weaknesses than its alternative or than its opponent. And so that will give us a provisional justification, at least, for pursuing that theological option in the rest of the lecture series as opposed to its opponent. Now, before we continue this process of evaluation, let's remind ourselves of what the two theological options are. The first theological option is what I called the theology of Streit, where Streit is the German word for struggle or striving. According to Streit theology, our fundamental experience of divinity is one of struggling or striving to wrest clarity or openness or disclosure from obscurity or hiddenness or concealment, so that our fundamental encounter with divinity is an encounter with a paradox or an enigma from which we try to wrest some measure of clarity. On the other hand, according to Gelassenheit theology, the other experience that Heidegger describes in his later writings, that is the experience of Gelassenheit, of letting be, of tranquilized energy or energized tranquility. According to Streit theology, that experience pertains to the piecemeal process whereby we become free from certain problematic metaphysical or perhaps other philosophical assumptions that threaten to occlude or obscure our encounter with divinity. So that's the first theological option. The second theological option I called the theology of Gelassenheit, and this option inverts the philosophical associations that we just described, so that, according to Gelassenheit theologian, our experience of divinity, our fundamental encounter with divinity, is a kind of energized tranquility, a kind of peaceful dwelling in which we share intimacy with divinity, whereas the experience of struggle or Streit pertains to the process, the very difficult process of freeing ourselves from problematic metaphysical or other kinds of philosophical assumptions. So those are the two theological options that we're comparing. Now, last time we listed the respective strengths and weaknesses of Streit theology. This time we're going to do the same thing for Gelassenheit theology. So let's begin with the strengths. Now, one strength of Gelassenheit theology is that it does inject definite experiential content into our encounter with divinity, because, as we just said, it associates that encounter with this very definite experience of peaceful serenity or energized tranquility. We all know what that experience is like, and so by associating that with our encounter of divinity, Gelassenheit theology assigns a very definite phenomenological profile to our encounter with divinity. And that's a good thing. That's an advantage. That's a strength. A second strength of Gelassenheit theology is that, at least prima facie, it does draw a very clear line between the activity of wrestling or dealing with metaphysical obscurity or metaphysical conundrums and our encounter with divinity. So that, if trying to become free of metaphysical confusion is a kind of struggle, whereas encountering divinity is a kind of peaceful serenity, then we know, at least experientially, those are very different activities, those are very different phenomena phenomena, and so we can draw a clearer line there. Now I say prima facie because I want to come back to that in a minute. On closer inspection, things are not so clear. But we'll come back to that in just a second. Now that we've given a couple of advantages of the Gelassenheit theological option, let's look at some weaknesses. Let's look at some disadvantages. Now the first one is that if we associate our encounter with divinity, if we identify our encounter with divinity with this experience of peaceful serenity, as the Gelassenheit theologian would have us do, the danger there is that the experience of peaceful serenity threatens to become rather boring over time. It's the same. Nothing ever really changes. Everything threatens to sort of level out and become very bland, so that our experience of God threatens to become rather boring eventually. That's a real problem, because human beings, at least so far as we understand our lives, human beings need, from time to time, they need things to stimulate them. They need excitement. They need challenges. They need something that isn't so easy to understand, that stimulates them or provokes them to try to bring some kind of clarity out of that. If all of that's taken away when we encounter divinity, then who's to say that our encounter or our dwelling with divinity won't eventually just collapse into a kind of colossal boredom? And we don't want that. That's a very serious liability. Now, one thing that we can observe here, though, already, is that within Gelassenheit theology, there seems to be a silver lining here. Because remember how I've been describing this experience of Gelassenheit. It is a kind of energized tranquility. Now, notice well that a kind of energy, or something being energized and something being tranquil, those are two very different notes within the overall experience of Gelassenheit. And so if there is a kind of energized component within this overall experience, then that would suggest, at least phenomenologically, that it might be possible to recover something within this Gelassenheit experience that will make sure and will militate against allowing our encounter with divinity simply to collapse into a kind of colossal boredom. Because there's a tension there. There's a tension between the serenity part, or the tranquil part, and the energized part, or the active part. Now that is something that we're going to need to look at more closely in subsequent lectures, but it is a silver lining. All right, that was one disadvantage of Gelassenheit theology. Another disadvantage, at least potentially, has to do with this division that we were just talking about between metaphysical deconstruction, getting rid of problematic metaphysical or philosophical assumptions that interfere with our experience in God, on the one hand, and that experience of the holy. Now, so far, what we're not sure about, or what's not clear is, it is clear that Gelassenheit theology wants to deconstruct certain problematic notions. The problem is that there's a risk of deconstructive overkill here. Why exactly is it that the deconstructive process is limited to metaphysical or philosophical notions? Why isn't it the case that it could very well turn out that the same kind of deconstructive process spills over into religious concepts like God or the holy or the Trinity or divinity or whatever? These various theological notions are not, a priori at least, immune to deconstruction. And so, yes, experientially we can say that Gelassenheit theology, by associating an experience of struggling with metaphysical deconstruction and associating the very different experience of tranquilized energy or energized tranquility with our encounter in God, yeah, experientially those are two very different things. But when we get down to the nitty-gritty, how can we be sure that the deconstructive process aimed at metaphysical and philosophical notions, at least ones that are problematic, once that snowball begins to roll, who's to say that it will stop there? Why can't that spill over into theology so that religious notions are also deconstructed? so that at the end of the day we're not left with anything. We're just sort of left with a kind of, well, deconstructive supremacy, but we don't really have anything left, in any meaningful sense at least, of the experience of divinity and the notion of divinity itself, because it will have fallen by the wayside no less than the problematic philosophical notions that have already been deconstructed. So how does that process get stopped? We could always try to draw a charmed circle around theological or religious notions, but why? Why is that? Now, here again, it seems to me at least that there is a silver lining, though, for the Gelassenheit theologian. Because remember that in the third proto-theology that we describe, and that the Gelassenheit theologian wants to inject definite phenomenological content into, there is a reciprocal sense in which, on the one hand, the non-metaphysical event of being needs, the holy needs the non-metaphysical event of being. In other words, our experience of the holy, in order not to be occluded, needs kind of metaphysical deconstruction in order to avoid that obscurity. But there's a reciprocal need in that we also saw Heidegger thinks, or strongly suggests, that the non-metaphysical event of being, now identified with this kind of deconstructive process, that needs the experience of the holy, or it needs the holy in order to become sheltered. Now, what that means exactly remains to be clarified, but as a silver lining, we can say that if the holy is needed by the process of metaphysical deconstruction, then it's very unlikely that that process is going to swallow up the holy, because then that need will no longer be satisfied. Now, it's up to the Gelassenheit theologian to explain precisely what these senses of reciprocal need are. That is, it needs to be explained not only the sense in which the non-metaphysical event of being is needed by the holy in order to avoid confusions about the holy, but the non-metaphysical event of being itself needs the holy as some kind of a guide or some kind of a placeholder. That needs to be explicated. But at least there is a kind of silver lining there that tends in the favor of the Gelassenheit theologian. Now, finally, the third weakness of Gelassenheit theology, at least as we've discussed it so far, is one that it shares with Strike theology, and that is that it's by no means clear exactly what connection Gelassenheit theology has to the central notions or doctrines or beliefs of Christian orthodoxy. What does Gelassenheit theology have to do, for example, with the doctrine of the Incarnation? What does it have to do with the doctrine of the Trinity or atonement or any of these other central tenets that are at the very heart of the Christian tradition? So far, we don't really have any definite connection there. Now, that, as I said, though, is a difficulty that Gelassenheit theology shares with Strike theology. So the score is even there. Now, let's step back for a minute and let's look at what we have. We saw that, let's look at the ledger in its totality. We saw that the Strike theologian has a pair of strengths, and it also has a number of weaknesses. And we've seen that the Gelassenheit theological option, similarly, also has strengths and weaknesses. But we also saw in our discussion of Gelassenheit theology that there is, in connection with each of the weaknesses that we discussed, there is a silver lining. So now what that suggests is that if we're going to proceed from here, we have a motivation to see whether those silver linings can actually be spun into gold, if you will. In other words, can we develop these silver linings in such a way that we offer Gelassenheit theology a very clear answer to the objections that have been lodged against it so far, let's say in this particular lecture. Now, the same thing could be done with Strike theology, and as I've said previously, it is by no means my intention to discourage the development of a Strike theology that is related to Christian orthodoxy. but we have to make a decision, a provisional decision, about how we're going to proceed here and now. And from what we've seen so far, the provisional decision that we ought to make is to pursue Gelassenheit theology. So, what we're going to do in the remaining lectures in this series is take the fundamental, the proto-theology, the most favorable of the three that we first extracted from Heidegger. We're going to start with that, and we saw that according to this proto-theology, the divinity, or God, is neither a particular being nor the non-metaphysical event of being itself, but in fact is a kind of non-being that, unlike fictions, is something that shelters being and is something that being and beings need, that they need in order to become sheltered. The Gelassenheit theologian, building upon the foundation of that proto-theology, then injects definite and very rich experiential content into our experience of divinity. In particular, that experience or that encounter is one of a kind of energized tranquility. The energized tranquility itself, as we can see from that phrase, has two components. One is a kind of energy and one is a kind of tranquility. The dialectic between those two components within the overall experience of Gelassenheit is what offers us a promise to ward off the danger that Gelassenheit, as this peaceful dwelling with God, will lapse into a kind of quiescence, will deteriorate into a kind of colossal boredom. That tension promises to militate against that. And we also saw that the need that non-metaphysical being has for the holy means that the holy, and perhaps we can say this a little bit clearly now, more clearly now, the holy has to have some kind of autonomy vis-a-vis non-metaphysical being. Because if it, only then can the holy satisfy the need that non-metaphysical being has. Only then can the holy provide some kind of guidance. Now, I understand that a lot of this probably sounds rather abstruse, but what I want to do in the remaining lectures is show that it's not abstruse. We can bring this down to very specific things and very specific moral challenges that have confronted human beings in the history of Western European civilization. In particular, we're going to see that the challenge of National Socialism is something that really needs some kind of holy, autonomous, holy presence in order to dissuade it from collapsing into a kind of very autocratic and totalitarian deconstruction. Because philosophy of that kind is not morally neutral. So what I want to do later is bring a lot of this down to earth by looking at some very specific examples. Now, next time, that's all we're going to do for today. We've reached our provisional decision. We're going to pursue Gelassenheit theology to the best of our ability. Next time, I am going to take up a particular source that I think will help to unpack further the notion of Gelassenheit, consisting of these two fundamental components of energy and tranquility in energized tranquility. And that is the very famous discussion of the holy by Rudolf Otto in his seminal work, The Idea of the Holy. That book offers, I'm going to argue next time, the Gelassenheit theologian very significant, substantive, and powerful resources for turning those silver linings, for spinning them into gold, as I said, and trying to develop Gelassenheit theology so that it's not just a theological option, but that it is a full-blown theology that is ready to be brought into engagement with Christian belief. So that's all for today. Thank you very much for joining me. Again, I would encourage anyone who has questions to list them on my YouTube channel. You can leave messages and I will try to respond to them to the best of my ability. But I do look forward to your questions if you have them, or to your comments. And if you have any concerns, then we will try to work through them together. But for today, this is Peter Dillard signing off. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to discussing these very interesting issues with you more next time. Thank you.